While there can be, and has been, debate and discussion about when exactly the Dema story began in a more subtle fashion, what album or what year did it start playing a role in the music of 21 Pilots, there is no debate that the narrative began to unfold in its fullness with the release of the album Trench. Now, 7 years later, we are in the middle of the Clancy album cycle, and yet it does not seem as though 7 years have passed in that world. But can we know that for sure, or is it purely speculation? And if we can know that for sure, then would it not conflict with other elements of the timeline which we have so far assumed to be true? When we look at the timeline of a story which takes place in a fictional world which doesn't use our calendar, the exact timeline of that story can start to get a bit fuzzy. And the Dema story is no exception to this. But the problem here is that the story at some moments appears to be plotted along a timeline which is similar to ours, and then at other moments it seems as though that would be an impossibility. For instance, in one of Clancy's earliest journal entries, he explains that he has been in the city of Dema for a total of 9 years. That journal entry was written in 2018, and 9 years prior was 2009, the same year that the band released their self-titled album, which was also their debut album. And I think many others, have long assumed that associating those dates works this well for a reason. Certainly, 21 Pilots have a track record of being very careful and intentional with their use of numbers. And while the number 9 is already significant for other reasons, 9 bishops, 9 circles, and so on, it seems strange that they would include a specific mention of 9 years if that wasn't supposed to be a clue pointing us towards their self-titled album. Now, the reason that debut album is important is something which I've covered in other videos and is not the purpose of this discussion. But the point here is to illustrate how we have a one-to-one correspondence between the Trench timeline and our own. However, I am not sure that we can say that continues throughout the rest of the story, especially when looked at in the light of the I Am Clancy video. Clancy escapes Dema, is captured, brought back, and is forced to write and perform Scaled and Icy. During one of those performances, he escapes, lands on Voltsoy, meets Ned and the Torchbearer, and the next morning begins traveling back to the Bandito camp. He arrives there in the evening, and then with the sunrise of the following morning, they attack the city of Dema. In other words, while we do not get to visually see what takes place between the end of Levitate and the start of Scaled and Icy, we do quite clearly see what happens between the end of Scaled and Icy and the start of Clancy. One appears to follow directly after the other, but we also see two banditos at the end of the outside who are supposed to have grown up considerably since the end of Nico and the Niners, which itself throws the whole timeline into question once again. So it seems to me that there are three possible explanations for this. One, we were completely wrong to ever try to match up the Trench timeline with our own. The release of the self-titled album, 9 years prior to the release of that letter from Clancy, was purely a coincidence. And in reality, 9 years prior in the world of Trench would have been decades earlier in our world. Two, the time dilation in Trench ebbs and flows. At some points, it matches up exactly with our timeline and our time, but at other points it moves much slower. And three, the I Am Clancy video does not tell us the whole truth about the story so far. There have been other elements to this video which I have also found to be potentially inconsistent in the past, so this is not wholly unlikely, and certainly raises interesting questions in its own right. As a result, the timeline of Trench does consistently match onto our own timeline, and as a result, the opposite is also true. Therefore, years pass between Clancy's capture in Levitate and his forced performance in Scaled and Icy. And I find this third option to be the most likely, that the timelines of the world of Trench and our own match up perfectly, or at least when moving from one album cycle to the next. I think it is very unlikely that 9 months pass between the end of Saturday and the beginning of the Outside. But this does mean that 17 months pass between Heavy Dirty Soul and Jumpsuit, 3 years between Levitate and Shy Away, and 2 more years between the Outside and Overcompensate. And while at first glance it seems that it is very improbable, would you remember that it is a story about repeating cycles and time looping? It becomes much more possible. It would also explain why the towers of Dema appear to be unscathed after the fire which Clancy starts in the Outside. because 2 years would be ample time to repair them, whereas 2 or 3 days is not so much. But what do you think? With that being said, thank you for watching, and be sure to comment your own thoughts on this below. And don't forget to subscribe for more music commentary and reviews.